Hello and welcome to the GAA Museum Virtual Book Club. Each month, the museum team will choose a well-known GAA book to read and review before hosting an online interview with the author. In March, we reviewed The Hurlers by Paul Rouse. Please enjoy this recording of the Q&A session. If you're not a member of the book club already, it's free to join at crokepark.ie/book club.
Hi, Julianne here from the GAA Museum. Some of you may have met me before. Thank you all for taking part in the book club, and thanks in particular to this evening's speaker, who is the author of the amazing book we've just finished, The Hurlers, and that's Paul Rouse, who's a historian, lecturer in UCD, where he is at the moment, and all-round good GAA guy. And also, we just said we better declare at the start we're both from Tullamore. So if our accents get too awfully, you can let us know in the chat box. I leave the chat box open as well, so if anybody wants to ask a question, they can just type it away there and we'll go through them. I have a few questions that you guys have sent in already as well, which is brilliant. And as we go along, other things might come up, so it doesn't have to be even about the book. It can be about, I suppose, the process of the book and maybe other things around, I suppose, the findings of the book as well. So I'm going to put Paul on so you can see him and you can hear me. So there you go. And we'll get going, I suppose, first of all, by saying it was an amazing book, and for my shame, I don't think I knew 80% of it, which is mad considering I'm a lifelong GAA fan from a kind of a family that would be my dad's East Galway, so a big hurling part of the country, and it features in the book a lot. And also I work in the museum, and I knew bits and pieces of the story, but I suppose I didn't always know how it all went together. I say, for example, I knew about the invasion tour. I knew about Michael Cusack's strong personality. Everybody knows about Hayes' Hotel. And I knew that the clubs used to be the people who represented the counties rather than a county team. But it was amazing to have it threaded all together in a book that, while it's historic and it's, as a historian, it's still a very good read, which is hard with so many place names, dates, and movement around the country. So I suppose, where did you start is the first question.
I got the idea in Tullamore, as you rightly pointed out. Tullamore is the centre of the universe. And, I was working in the local paper in Tullamore. I was working in Tullamore Tribune and then in the Offaly Express. And in doing that work, I came across this old clipping that said the first All-Ireland hurling final had been played in Burr. It was actually a kind of a reprint, and this is in the mid-90s, of an account of that day, a really short account that had been published in the Midland Tribune on that day.
Yeah.
And I just got interested in it, and I spent the guts of 20 years putting aside pieces of material as I came across it on this day, because it seemed to me in the middle of the 90s, when Offaly were, oh happy day, winning All Irelands, it seemed to me amazing the fact that you had a redeveloping Croke Park as it was by 1998, with the new stands being constructed and everything.
Yeah.
But then you had an All-Ireland hurling final being played in Burr. And to me, this was astonishing. And the more I looked into it and into the story, I just became fascinated by the people who were involved in it, because this was an All-Ireland final that was run in the middle of a land war.
Yeah.
Which people think of the land war as being 1879 to 1882, but the truth of it is it ran through the 1880s and beyond. The teams that were represented in that final and the place of that final was right at the heart of the land war. There were players on both teams who were the subject of evictions.
Yeah.
The band which would have led the players to the ground on that day didn't come to the game because of an eviction. There were IRB men and rebels and people of no politics and people who were moderate nationalists all on the field on that day. Around the field were British soldiers, members of the Scottish Regiment, the Highland Regiment, who were based in Crinkle in Burr. And I just slowly began to work through the newspapers of those years to find out the story of hurling and what happened in that kind of key moment between 1884, when the GAA was founded, and then the establishment of that first championship in 1887 and the playing of the final in 1888. And every step along the way, I was finding something new, something really interesting. At least it was fascinating to me. And I thought, oh, wow, this is incredible. And then I'd find something else.
Yeah.
And I think the most stunning thing for me was very close to the end. I found the fact that when Michael Cusack went back to Hayes' Hotel to a gathering of the GAA in 1887, someone fired a gun over his head.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Point. This is just unreal. And it's just story after story of things that happened in those years, the wildness of it, but also things that we can identify with. The desire to win a match and the desire to do pretty much anything to win a match.
Well, actually, I've written down like similarities between like things we still talk about, and like, you know, people get so frustrated with the admin at the GAA, but looking back at it now, I can see how all of it came about. There was rows over fixtures, rows over ex-players' expenses, you know, things that we still talk about. It's absolutely incredible, and I suppose you kind of you think of it as a long time ago, but it's not really. Like, you know, there's people that lived into the like to 1940s that were playing in the final, so it's amazing.
I've met people who knew people who played in that final.
Yeah,
tells you how recent it is. I met a man in Thurles, just a tremendous man in Thurles, who brought me to the graveyard up in Thurles where all those Tipperary hurling.
Yeah, you described that lovely in the book.
But his dad was a friend of Michael Cusack, and when Cusack went to Thurles, it was in his father's pub that Cusack went. So this is not at a remove that is enormous from our time. It's deeply connected to it. It's several generations, of course, but there are still people alive who knew people who played in that final, and that's a really striking thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like The Bloodied Field, which was our last book, in that if it wasn't done now, you know, maybe it would have been lost. Like, it needed someone to do it. Why do you think no one tackled the topic before? Like, it's an incredible story. It could be a movie.
It could be a movie, but I do think, though, the wildness of Ireland at the time, the fact that it was all new, like, we're looking at the modern sporting world being created at that time, and there were things that were happening even outside the GAA that are amazing. Like, an Irish lacrosse team went on a trip to Canada at the time to play matches. An Irish cricket team went on a trip to America. Athletics teams came from all over the world to compete in Ireland. We think of our world as modern and globalized, and of course it is, and because of the internet everything is speeded up. But the 1880s were an incredibly globalized time as well. It just all took a lot slower to get around. But the key point of it is, this was the modern sporting world in the making. So these guys were absolutely pioneers, and we have to say it was all men. There was no place for women in the GAA
I have a few questions.
Those years. Yeah, it's just true. It's just true. This was absolutely a man's world created for men, and even though women were referred to as being present at the sidelines of matches, and the first photograph of a hurling match, of a live hurling match, dates from the mid 1890s from Tipperary and Borrisoleigh. There were women all around in their Sunday finery, all around that pitch. But the idea that women would play at that stage, it just doesn't come up in it just doesn't come up in the books.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And I thought, talking about movies, it's definitely something that should be considered. But the scene when you're in the courthouse in Thurles, I think that could be a play in itself. It's an incredible scene, and the descriptions are hilarious and funny in one way. But then you think, this is real. This is the GAA, and this isn't that long ago. The priest falling through the table, the journalist hiding under behind him, and afraid that things were going to fall on the fourth estate, as you say in the book. It's an incredible story, and I just was so surprised as I read it.
And crucial to that story, Julianne, crucial to that story is that the story of the 1880s is always told, or often told, as being radical nationalists v priests.
Yeah.
But in the middle were two other groups. There were moderate nationalists and people of no politics. And a large swathe of people who were there for the hurling, there for the football, and were not necessarily aligned to any party. And I think that really matters.
Yeah, and as you say, like the GAA, because it grew so quickly and had so many members, reflected society as a whole. So it everyone's views, there were, and I thought the story about Gladstone and the Cork contingents going over to present him with the Hurley for a tie pin, like those things are amazing. I was also thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great to get that for the museum? But I'm sure, I'm sure it's long gone.
Interesting. No, actually, it's a very good point. What happens to objects like that when they go to figures there? Was that just cast to one side, or is it in some sort of a collection in England?
Yeah, I was wondering, because it was
for people who don't know that story, basically what happened was members of the Cork GAA went over to meet William Gladstone, who was, of course, a favourite son of Nationalist Ireland at the time because he was supporting the granting of home rule to Ireland, and they presented him with a kind of a lockets of hurleys and balls, a miniature hurley and replicas of various implements to do with the GAA. And the idea that should happen now, that the GAA present to the British Prime Minister or former British Prime Minister a thing like that, while Ireland was as yet not independent, is quite striking.
And as they said, he immediately put it on as well, which I think was very interesting. The whole thing was incredible, and as I said, I can't believe I didn't know it, and I studied history. It's just so that was the main, I suppose, starting point was where do you begin, and how many newspapers did you have to read? How important were newspapers as a tool?
Oh, I'm a small bit bitter about this. I started this research through the newspapers, apart from the Offaly papers, which I did in the 90s. When I came back to Dublin in the early 2000s, I started to go through into the National Library evening after evening, going through more than 40 local newspapers between 1880 and 1888 to try and find evidence of hurling. And as I was finished them, almost all of these papers were digitized, and I would have been just able to go through hurling and find them. But I think it was a great benefit to me to have to do that, because I learned so much history of the period and was able to set the hurling in context rather than just doing a word search of hurling through the thing. But where it did come really useful is I never thought of going through the Irish Times at the time, because it was a unionist paper, and it was because it was a paper that was given to rugby and to cricket and to horse racing. But I just thought just to be kind of comprehensive, I put hurling into it, and I found, because I put hurling into its search engine, and I would never have found this otherwise, I put hurling into its search engine, and I found the letters that were exchanged between Michael Cusack and two other men in December 1883. Omega, Alpha and Omega. It led to the founding of the Dublin Hurling Club, and on in time to the founding of the Gaelic Athletic Association. So I think I was really lucky in that, as a researcher, I researched either side of the digital divide. So I got the benefit of the history that I read by going through the papers, and then I had the good fortune to be able to put in terms and find more specific stuff.
Yeah, it was the perfect start to the book. I don't know if anyone else thinks it, but it was so dramatic. The code names or the pseudonyms. And
yes.
Do you think it was planned? Like, did Mike, because he was friendly with that guy who eventually turned out to be Amiga, do you think they planned it as like a public discourse, and you write this letter and then I'll reply to you, or was it more organic than that?
My instinct is that it was planned. My instinct is that they knew each other. It feels to me the reply was too quick and too positive, and the plan to have the meeting was too
polished.
It was all too polished for it to be anything other than staged. But it's a reminder, of course, as well, that the internet of the 1880s was the newspaper, and the fact that there were newspapers now cheaply available for the first time in history, between printing presses and the reduction in stamp duty and everything. Newspaper and the rise in literacy, 92% of the Irish population were literate by 1890. So we've got a really literate society. Cheap newspapers, and people use them as a slower form of conversation, obviously, than what you see with Twitter and Facebook and everything around it. But it was a means of conversation and a place for public. It was the public square, really, was the newspaper, and it allowed people to do these things. And I have no doubt. Sorry, I do have doubt, because you never know 100%, but I really believe it was planned. That Cusack wrote this letter Amiga replied, and it just feels like it was a setup.
It was exciting, and even the timing of it, it was a really good start because it was kind of mysterious. But I had written in my notes as well that I found the way people use newspapers and like as it progressed, fought through the newspapers or argued through the newspapers, is very like social media now. And
brutal to each other. They were absolutely brutal.
Yeah, but probably used nicer language than we do now, and had a better command of the English language. Michael Cusack in particular, and I know you say in the book that it would have been boring, a lot of the correspondence, because it was infighting, but because he wrote so well, it made it so entertaining.
Yeah, and he didn't hold back. I mean, you were never left doubting what Michael Cusack thought about you or about anybody once he started. Like once he got stuck into people, like he really went for them. And like, he people who didn't agree with him, who were rugby players, were, like, in his word, orange Catholics. When he fell out with pretty much everybody who was his friend at various stages. And when one guy, GAC Christian, acted against him, he described him as acting with the characteristic idiotic insolence of his class. And there's a bit where the Irish Amateur Athletic Association was founded in opposition to the GAA to kind of take control of athletics in Ireland by existing athletics clubs. And after a year of infighting, Croke wrote to them and said, to all sections, and said, look, this is ridiculous. This is a small country. The idea you should be boycotting each other's meetings and having a ban, it's just wrong. So this guy Dunbar wrote to Cusack, who was his friend, and said, previously a friend, they'd been at an athletics club together in the early 1880s, and said, look, the Archbishop is right, basically, we need to things. And Cusack wrote back to him a letter which he also sent simultaneously to all the newspapers in the city, saying, dear John, I received your letter this morning and I burned it. Yours sincerely, Michael Cusack. So he was not a man given to taking prisoners.
Yeah, there was great one-liners when you go through it. But I was thinking as well, it'd be something the museum we could look at, even an exhibition on those. Something if you could find them, they are incredible. And why do you think? Because I know there's a photo of him in the book as part of that Phoenix Rugby Club. Why did he go so against? Like, why was it just hurling in particular, more so even than Gaelic football?
It's really interesting. It's one of the great things we are asked to do and expected to do as historians, is to explain why people do certain things and why things happen. And the truth of it is that anybody who offers you a neat, calm, boxed off version of history is not credible, because things are much more complicated than that. There are jagged edges in history. So my best explanation for why Cusack changed from being somebody, as you remember, in 1879 founded a rugby club, 1881 played in the first ever Leinster Senior Cup match for Phoenix Rugby Club. As late as the autumn of 1882 is calling for the establishment of a cricket club in every parish in Ireland, says it's a great way to teach lads pluck and candour and all of this. So he's part of that sporting world of the British Empire, if truth be told. And then within 4 months, he's calling for the establishment of a Dublin hurling club, and that rolls on in time to the Metropolitan Hurling Club and the founding of hurling. So what was the reason for the quick change? I think it can be explained in the first instance by context. So the land war is moving on, and the country is beginning to be rent by land war. So that's important, but it's a slow burner. It's just there in the background.
Yeah.
In 1882, there was the genuine prospect of home rule for Ireland for the first time with the rise of Charles Stewart Parnell. The IRB are in the background, and they bomb Downing Street during these years. They put bombs in there, and they're revolutionary separatists dedicated to the overthrow of British rule in Ireland. At least some of them are. There's a lot of them who are there for picnics and for social outings, but broadly speaking, there are others who are there intent on revolution. So that's all there in the background. But specific to his time in 1882, late 1882, is the rise of an organisation called Aontacht na Gaeilge, which, if you read the minute books of it, are really interesting. Aontacht na Gaeilge, the Gaelic Union, its full title is the Gaelic Union for the Preservation and Cultivation of the National Language. the GAA's title was eventually the Gaelic Athletic Association for the
Yeah.
Preservation and Cultivation of the National Games. Number one. Number two, its patron was Archbishop Croke.
Okay.
So we learned from that. So you have those two things happening, and Cusack became involved in Aontacht na Gaeilge in the end of 1882 in the Irish language revival. Meetings were held in his school in Dublin. He paid for the publication of the first ever magazine published in Ireland. So he became interested in language revival in the way that he had previously. Number three, there was an exhibition of Irish-made goods just down the road from where he lived. And many people will know the Derg Vale Hotel from walking to Croke Park, by it on their way across from Parnell Square. And Cusack just down from there was a first ever exhibition of Irish-made goods. So you get a rise of another form of these things. So all of these things matter. But there's a fourth thing, and we've alluded to it earlier, and it's Cusack's personality. Cusack had more or less fallen out with everyone in the Dublin athletics world at the time. And Cusack was, in the first instance, committed, and the GAA was, in the first instance, committed to the revival of Irish athletics. And if you look at the first year of the history of the GAA, it is athletics, not football or hurling, which dominated. It's only
it's amazing
that the two games come on. So I think it's a combination of all of those personal, on the one hand, event-specific things, and then the background. The three things meld together into pushing him to change his mind. And finally, what he was reading. So what he was reading really mattered. For the first time in the early 1880s, popular editions of books about the heroes of Irish history were being published. And by heroes, I mean mythological heroes.
Yeah.
So there was a book published which was Cuchulainn an Epic in popular form, and Cusack read it. And in this Cuchulainn an Epic, the heroic Irishman was a hurler. And hurling was used to demonstrate prowess. And in this, that's what Cusack saw now as a motif for kind of for a revival of Irishness, that hurling was the way to do this. And the way he began to write about hurling from early 1883 onwards was about the hurler as hero.
Yeah, I was going to say some of the references in the book are about if it's a good match he does, that's how he refers to the
that's how he does it. Yeah. He uses that language of the heroic.
But the language is amazing, and I suppose luckily for the association, his personality was so interesting, and he wrote so much, so that there was probably, now looking back at it, we wouldn't be here without him, but there wouldn't be as much information about it either available. So
I think that really matters. There were a huge number of journalists, not just Cusack, involved in the early GAA, and they filled out their newspapers with reports on the early GAA. I think it should also be said on Cusack that he was thrown out of the GAA in May 1886 as General Secretary because he again had fallen out with everyone and he hadn't done his basic administrative stuff. Yeah. And I think that matters. That tells you it is a fair achievement for the founder of an organisation which was then thriving and spreading as to his own words, like a prairie fire across Ireland.
Yeah.
Still managed to get himself thrown out of the GAA in May 1886.
So quickly afterwards. Like, I knew there had been controversy, but I didn't realise that it happened so quickly, and the timeline of events. And on the administration, like, it was very funny the way you describe it in the book, that he just basically didn't answer any letters, couldn't have been worse at administration. And then you had, on the other hand, Davin, who, like, basically that was his thing, and that's his strong point, and you needed that side as well. So I suppose in one way Cusack was nearly the PRO or the communications, and Davin was the admin and the guy behind the scenes keeping it all together.
Yeah, and Cusack is just a genius, but a peculiar genius. Yeah. And incredibly inspirational, really fascinating man. Davin was solid, methodical, organised, everything that a modern sporting organisation needs when it comes to establishing rules. It was Davin who wrote the first rules for football, hurling and athletics. It was Davin who penned the first constitution. It was Davin who held the whole thing together when it all was falling apart and was being pulled asunder by radical Republicans during those years. And still they got on. They managed to keep and I said Cusack fell out with all his friends. He did, but with the exception of Davin, which
is probably a huge achievement on Davin's part.
On Davin's behalf, I think that's very fair. And so Davin is fundamental as well to the GAA and all of these things. But there's another thing that we must remember, and that is that the GAA's story of its own history, and I hope this is okay to say in a museum organised event, but the GAA is a story of its own history. For many years, I don't think it was accurate and fair, because it tells a story of hurling disappearing after the famine, and then Michael Cusack wandering in and basically, through this dint of personality, re-establishing a game. But that's not actually really true, because a form of hurling was being played in North Tipperary and in East Galway and in West Donegal and in East Antrim and in pockets in Cork and in little bits of Kerry, in South Offaly, various little pieces hurling was being played, but it was being played in the traditional way. What wasn't happening was that it hadn't taken on the form of a modern sporting organisation, and that's where Davin is crucial.
Yeah, and I suppose he looked to the UK, and you mentioned the FA Cup, and obviously they were trying to get away from that, but then ironically they needed, I suppose, some kind of a structure to follow. So it was happening, I guess, across Europe, where games were codifying, and it wasn't a free for all anymore. So it had to be done.
It had to be done, and they look. Our formal, we can dress this up any way we want, but the basic fact is that what the GAA is an Irish spin on an English form of sporting organisation. That is the organisation of a club structure, given into a governing body. That's how the English started to organise sport, and that's what we aped, and that's the form of sport that is, broadly speaking, accepted around the world, with America being a crucial influence in all of this as well. And the fact that Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, two islands united in one kingdom, so close to that kind of heartland of the sporting revolution, gave the Irish a head start on it. And it's, for example, a reason why you can understand why Ireland won more than 20 gold medals in the Olympic Games between 1896 and 1920, because it was there at the heart of the modern sporting world, because it was tied into an empire. I'm not trying to use this as a justification for empire or of the United Kingdom. It's just a fact that the ties of kinship and of commerce and of trade and of basic geographical proximity left Ireland tied into this.
Yeah, it's amazing. And Davin is an interesting character in his own right as well. Like, the picture is amazing in the book. I had seen it.
Brilliant. It's a great picture.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, there's amazing things in the museum about Davin, and Davin's handbook, where he shows how he did his training, and Davin's record of it's really interesting. We all like to think that the modern sporting world is incredibly different, but if you read Davin stuff in the 1870s, Davin was fresh fruit, eating fish, eating vegetables, said you can't drink, you can't smoke, he used to dip, he used to have ice baths. Basically, he used to go into a cold well every morning. He kept a record, because he subscribed to papers all around America and Britain, of his main competitors, what they were doing in athletics when he was competing, so that he could match them. And it says a lot. Davin and his brothers were superb athletes in general, and it says a lot. Like, some of the cups in the museum, if I remember correctly, one of them is of a rowing competition that Davin won, and Davin used to race in regattas all around the south east coast of Ireland, and one of them, it was in a boat he made himself. I mean, that's the kind of level of sickening brilliance that the man could turn to.
Yeah, they're two, like, you couldn't make it up. If you were writing a book about it, you wouldn't believe that two such characters could exist and be together at one moment in time. And actually, one of the questions that came in earlier was on Davin, and I suppose on your primary sources. So the question is, was Maurice Davin's writing legible? I find it fascinating that his notebooks still exist a century later and are available to study. Does Paul think it will be difficult for historians in years to come, when most things today are not written down in physical form but stored on computers and hard drives, that will be obsolete in 10 years, let alone 100 years? So I suppose there's a few bits in that.
That's a brilliant question. That is an absolutely brilliant question about the transformation to the digital world. And the truth of it is, we don't know the answer to that question, because we are in the early stages of a digital revolution that is transforming how we live, how we behave, how we work. Every aspect of our life is being touched by the change to digital communications, to the internet, to absolutely everything we know now. So that tells you, so I can't tell you how historians are going to work and how they're going to access this stuff. What I will tell you, though, is that what history is not the past. History is our version of the past, as people know. It seems like such an obvious thing to say, but just to be clear, to set out where I come from, And yes, it is true that we have writings left for Davin, and yes, it is true that we have stuff left in newspapers, but a huge amount of things happened in the 1880s that we have no record of. So just as a whole lot of things were lost, letters were destroyed, letters where conversations went unrecorded, papers might have been lost. We have no minute books for the GAA before 1899, for example. So no record of any time in history can be considered to be complete. And the challenges that we face in writing the history of the past, there will be different challenges faced by historians who try to write the history of our time. But what historians in the future will try to do, and I don't envy them. I don't know how they're going to work with social media. I don't know how they're going to mine from that and scrape the stuff that's relevant. But it is a reminder always that the judgments in history books are subjective judgments of historians, and to lead people to believe otherwise in terms of the choices of archive and the words that are used and the opinions that are based, they are subjective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know even say the government now, if you're the Taoiseach, is the Taoiseach's account, who owns that? If it's if it's their private account and it turns into, is it belong to the government, and who owns those files? And it's a huge thing.
Area. It's a great question.
Very. And was his writing legible?
I think it was. Insofar as I have to admit, it's about 15 or 16 years since I looked at it, but it was very legible. He was a meticulous man. You look at this is a man who took over. He had a large farm in Carrick-on-Shore, which he inherited while still a teenager when his dad died. But the family also had a river haulage business, which used to pull stuff up the river shore to Clonmel, from where he lived in Carrick-on-Shore. So this is a man who meticulously built a business, and he lived until his 80s. And he kept records on everything. He subscribed to encyclopedias from around the world. He kept a library at home.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a real 1880s middle class farmer. And you must remember, we like to think of the GAA as being for the working man and for the ordinary person around the place. But Davin had been in a major controversy in Carrick-on-Shore in the early 1880s, where he stood against the farm labourer with the stronger farmers. So this is history has an endless capacity to kind of undermine the things that you would like to believe.
Yeah, and people aren't one thing or another.
They're never one thing.
Aren't they? Yeah, everyone has, a few sides to them. And you mentioned, I suppose, that there was stuff that was burned and, things that we can't find now. Or maybe things that were never written about. So in that way, sport, I guess, is a good way, because there's records of sport, maybe more so than other parts of society. It's a good way of looking at society, I suppose, as a whole, and things people did, and transport. I thought that was quite interesting. The way people got around, the lads having to walk to the match and still play the final, but then trains, and we still have the match day train. That's still a thing. And I just thought, things that that they did, bonfires, all of that, and stuff that has maybe died out, but then stuff that's very much still around. It's an interesting. Sport is, I suppose, even if you're not into sport, the history of sport is a reflection of society, and it gives us a way into society.
Yeah, but sport does two things. It both reflects society, and it helps to change it or shift it a little bit, because it is now ubiquitous. It is possible to live in modern Ireland and not engage in sport, but you can't deny that it's everywhere. You may not like it, but it's a fact in terms of it lives in how it changes the geography and landscape of the country, and its presence in the media. So many people are involved in sporting organisations, or have kids involved in those organisations, or family of some sort involved in those organisations. So all of these things are a reality, and they have been for a long number of years. And if you ask yourself a very simple question: what is it that people talk about most or do most in the hours between when they're either working or sleeping? And sport is right up there on the list of things that people talk about or act out. And I think that matters. It tells you a lot about how society works and sport's place in that society.
Yeah, and I loved the more general picture, maybe around, the story of the sport, even the names of some of the societies. I wrote a few of them down. I thought they were gas. like, you know, just the Temperance Society, obviously, the Cork Butter Exchange Band, the Reading Room Society, the two bicycle clubs in Cork, you know, the Limerick Artisans Dwellings Committee, just, you know, the way the way society formed, and all of these were involved in the story of the first hurling match. It's incredible.
And if you think about it, Julianne, what will happen is in 100 or 150 years time, or even a shorter period of time, people will look at our world and find some of the things that we did entirely odd and of its moment. And that's the nature of history. It's not that there's ineluctable progress or that things are moving in a particular distance necessarily. It's that things change. Some things change. Loads of things stay the same, and basic impulses stay the same. And at the heart of this book is that basic thing that we can organize, we can understand, which is a competitive endeavor between teams representing clubs and then counties to win a championship. So to that end, it's something fundamental.
And I'm sure some of the rivalries that you talk about, like in the book, completely, you know, still are around, never more, like locally and nationally. You talk about the Cork-Kilkenny rivalry, which I thought was interesting. But each of the counties,
the way the Tipperary people talk about our people, Julianne, is it's unacceptable, and I don't think it should be forgiven.
Depends what side of the county you're from. If you're down the south, yeah. Then in Tullamore, we don't like the Laois and Westmeath neighbours don't like us so much.
We feel sorry for them, Julianne. We're not.
And actually, I have a question about Tullamore from a Tullamore man who's a member of the book club, and he says, I think it's a bit tongue in cheek. He says, "What did Paul think was hardest, writing this book, or trying to win a championship with Tullamore?"
That person, trying to win a championship with Tullamore was without doubt the hardest thing that any of us who were ever involved in that team ever did. We failed spectacularly. We couldn't get out of our own way for a very long number of years. We were a mess, and then we got better, and we fell over the line in the end a couple of times, and it was that was definitely harder.
I think you're being a bit modest. But do you think, as yourself, as a player, and you know, been involved in administration and all the different sides, manager of sport, did it make, as well as being a historian, did that make it easier to maybe write the book and get into the mentality of the characters?
I think so. I think it would. I think being from Offaly helped because of the locations of the book.
Yeah.
Being able to go to the other locations. I went to everywhere that I wrote about just to see the places and to get a feel for the place. Over a period of years, I went to them to see what they were like, and I think that was really, really important. And I think if you know a game, I think you have a feel for it in a way that you don't have. Like, I couldn't write about horse racing the way I'd write about hurling or football. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it struck me as I was writing it, and I was wondering, have you had any feedback maybe from people not from Ireland or who have no knowledge of hurling? Has, you know, maybe colleagues, have you had feedback from them about it?
Yeah, I have, and it's just fundamental interest in the idea that there is a different game, which is one of the main games in the country in a modern world, which is homogenizing and globalizing in terms of its culture, where the number one sport in the world is soccer, and the number two sport is, so that's the product of that English empire, British Empire of the 19th century. And the number two sport in the world, the second most popular sport in the world, is basketball, which is a product of the American cultural empire of the second half of the 20th century. So you see these vast global sports, and people are interested. People who work in sports history, or people who are just read sports books, they're interested in the idea that this is how an indigenous sport, or a sport that at least was created as being within a place, this is how it managed to carve out its own niche. And it is a fact that the GAA is itself, for all its flaws, for all its warts, for all its successes, for all its triumphs, for all the great things about it and for all the bad things about it, it's truly unique. And there is no organisation, like it in the world, and that doesn't mean that it is flawless. It's far from flawless. We see that today. We see that in the last week. We know these things, but at the same time, it's clear that's what people like reading about it, because it's different.
Yeah, and in the museum we would find that particularly people like that come from overseas, when they could come, hurling really fascinates them. There's something different about it, you know, and when we're trying to, I suppose, sell our products to tour operators, the first thing we have to go and do is try and explain hurling. And once they get it, like, you know, a girl from Photo Ireland who I was training with was like, just show them some footage of a match. Like that's best thing to do, because you can't, you know, have a slitter and a hurley in your hand and, you know, show
and away
them.
you go. Yeah, then you begin.
Yeah, it's interesting. And on that, I suppose that you talk a bit, I thought the story about how the slitter, they came about with the cork in the pub in Meelick, I thought that was a great story. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, and of course it's a reminder as well that some stories may not be, and I'm very careful to say this in the book, that's one of those stories that remains unproven, because these are things that people say, like people invent stories all the time. It is a basic fact of the past, that's separating fact from fiction.
And particularly in sport, when you're trying to maybe get one up on the opposing team, well, sure, we invented the ball. Like
no, exactly. And like people, I think the greatest example in the GAA's history of this is Hill 16. I mean, the idea that Hill 16 is called after the rubble of the 1916 Rising, of course, as we all know, is nonsense. It was built in 1915. So it would be an incredible achievement for the GAA to generate the rubble a year before the Rising actually took place. But people like the story. People like
that one's hard to get. Like we would, our tour guides encounter that one a lot, and they find it hard. I know a couple of them are joining us, but yeah, that's one they have to bat back a lot. You know, and there's
like
people.
There's so many versions of that story. Like that, the O'Rahilly's car is somehow buried underneath the rubble. That and it's just it's. But people like the idea.
They do, and it does no harm to the GAA or the mystery of Croke Park as well. You know, it's.
But I think the real story is much. I think the real story is much more interesting, and that is that it was called Hill 60 after a battle in World War One, in which lower GAA people and people fought in. I think that's a much more complicated and interesting story to tell than just a simple Irish nationalist martyrdom story.
Yeah, it is. You're right. And on actually the naming of the stands, I have another question about Michael Cusack. Considering Michael Cusack was seen as a divisive figure, particularly in the early years of the GAA, do you know the background to the stand named in his honour in Croke Park, or any other names put forward, etc.?
Yeah, do you know what? That's a really good question. Cusack's rehabilitation was a fascinating thing to watch. So what happened with Cusack was Cusack's life ended up in genuine tragedy. Very sad. It was really, really sad, and to me, that the saddest part of the book were a couple of parts. It was the eviction suffered by people and the loss of livelihoods of people who played in the matches, and Michael Cusack's story. And it's abundantly clear from Cusack's story that Cusack lapsed into alcoholism, and that alcoholism either got worse or was triggered by the fact that his wife Imelda died of TB. Margaret Imelda Woods died of TB in 1890, and a child of his died at the same time. Now he was left with 4 kids. I think the hardest thing in the book was I looked at the 1901 census returns, and 4 of Cusack's kids are living together at one stage in 1901, and he's living somewhere else. And Cusack died in 1906. He was still in his 50s, and like from Bly's disease, and it was clearly drink related, and that is thing. But by then he had been rehabilitated in the GAA because a new generation of officials had come in the early 1900s who were absolutely sympathetic to Cusack's newfound vision of native games and native language. And so tributes were paid to him in 1901, and an honorarium passed to him in 1901 when he attended the Congress. There was even talk that he would be brought back as General Secretary. So by the time of his death, Cusack was well honoured within the GAA. Within the GAA again. So the calling of the stand after him was a logical tribute from people who are now in sympathy with his aims. and who may not have felt the wrath of his tongue in the 1880s.
And who made the decision, do you know, or how did it come about?
All decisions on the naming of Croke Park were made by Central Council of the GAA as the stadium developed, and it was keeping. And it's really interesting, though, and this is Seamus, all right. So the Cusack stand was that, if I'm right, I'm going to say the 1930s, but I won't say that absolutely certainly. But Maurice Davin only had a stand named after him in the 1990s when Croke Park was redeveloped, and that was a tribute to Seamus O'Rian, his biographer, who was himself a president of the GAA and an absolutely tremendous man, a lovely man, but also a tremendous man.
Yeah, because even, that would be maybe the stand name that people are less familiar with. Well, that and the Deneen part of Hill 16, I guess. But and when you see the role, like, really Davin was the one that kept it all together. Without him, Michael Cusack, I know, was, I suppose, the publicity. But yeah, it's great that they did have it. But yeah, it's incredible it took until the mid-90s for that to happen. I have a couple of questions now, more, I suppose, on just the physical stuff about, you might or might not be able to answer this. So there's one of our, in the chat box, it says, Paul, I was always led to believe that one needed good land for hurling to prosper. Was it true in the past, and how relevant is it in the present?
Yeah, so that's Eamon Fitzgerald's question from Killarney. That's a brilliant question. The geography of hurling is, in my view, entirely misunderstood and not properly explained at this point. The traditional story is that there was a game played with a hard ball and a narrow stick in the north of the county, and in the south of the county there was a kind of a soft, bouncier ball and a wider boss blade, and that form of the game ultimately triumphed. And I don't belie that, because those hair hurling balls that were used in the south were found as far north as the bogs of North Sligo, and the narrow stick in the ball was used as far south as Valentia Island and as the Blaskets. So I don't believe that that's how culture works. I think there's exchanges all around the things, and I think there were different forms played in different places, but the idea that there was a line between them doesn't work. The question as to why hurling thrives in certain places and not in others is in part a reflection of the triumph of the game in those places where it endured until the GAA was founded. So that explains East Galway. It explains North Tip. It explains a couple of pockets in North Kerry. It explains Antrim and a little pocket like in Donegal and those areas around North Tip. So South Offaly, that part of Laois, which is given to hurling, and so on. But then why did it spread to other areas? So the question for Eamon, is it to do with good land? And I don't believe it's to do with good land, because there's plenty of really good land in the country where hurling is not widely played. And there is parts of it which is bad land where there is, like along the ranks of the Shannon in certain parts, where it is widely played. So it's not easily said, and human agency really matters in this. And I'll give you an example. There's a brilliant book published recently by Tom Hunt and Castletown Gagan GAA Club, which explains why Castletown Gagan Club is a major hot point of hurling in Westmeath, and it was to do with the arrival of Kilkenny teachers into the place and the spread of them in the game. And the fact is that the jersey that they wear was a black and amber stripe.
I love that.
So that story is replicated. Like, why is hurling now played in Waterford? Waterford people absolutely hate this, but it's true that it was lads from Mooncoin offered to put on hurling exhibitions down in Waterford to help spread the game there. There was no hurling in Wexford when the GAA was founded. And hurling spread in Wexford because a couple of people in Wexford decided to spread the game. So human agency and the work of several individuals is absolutely vital at key moments in history to the spread of a game. And anybody who doubts that also about the commitment to the game, long-term commitment, look at what is happening in Dublin hurling and has happened. Dublin may have 6 All-Ireland hurling championships, but no Dublin-born player has an All-Ireland hurling medal at inter-county level, because it was all country people essentially.
And even the fact that the Metropolitans were all going obviously down the country for the holidays they could play.
Exactly. So that is because people in Dublin are absolutely committed to the game, and you see then the rise of Coola and so on. So human agency is essential to this rather than land, in my view.
Yeah, and there was a story, I can't remember which county it was. There were the stories within each county of themselves were interested in the book. But was it, I can't remember, but there was somewhere that they were trying to get hurling going, and then did the hurleys get lost or something, and that was the end of it?
Yeah, but even if you look on a global way, there was hurling being played in Argentina by Irish exiles until the First World War, and a little bit between the two world wars, and then of course it stopped in the 1940s because the supply of ash was not plentiful anymore, and they couldn't get ash across on the boats, and the Buenos Aires hurling club became a hockey club, even though it's still called a hurling club. So you see, Irish immigrants took it with them, and played the game. But it is dependent. This is the difference between hurling and football. Football, you need a ball and a space. Hurling, you need timber and a ball and a space, and it is just not as easy.
Yeah, and nowadays you need a helmet as well. So
yeah, and a helmet, absolutely.
It's expensive, yeah. When they formed, there's nothing in the book, so I presume there was nothing happening underage. Like, when did all of that start to happen and actually develop? Because some of the teams obviously seem to stay together for a long time. There wasn't talent coming through every year.
By the late 1880s, they'd actually started in Thurles. They tried to put an underage team into Thurles, and that began to do it. But the tendency, though, was for kids to play together, not in an organised club way, but just to play them as soon as they were able to play with men in the field. And again, I'm saying men, not women. They play with men in the field, and away they go. Where it began to get different, though, was after 1900, as the GAA nearly collapsed and died in the early 1890s, but it rejuvenated in the late 1890s and into the 1900s. And part of this was the foundation of schools leagues, and they were crucial to this. And there's a model idea. Laois have only won one All-Ireland Hurling Championship. They won it in 1915, and it was 10 years in the making. It was 10 years in the making, built on the creation of an underage scene, on a school scene, and then a vibrant club scene, as well as on county training being properly organised. So they did all of those things together. So in the early 1900s, the successful counties had moved into this idea that they would go underage, and then in the 1920s you get a minor championship established.
Yeah, it's how quickly it all happened is amazing, isn't it? Yeah. I have a couple more questions. I know I'm making you talk a lot, so you can stop me. One is PP Sutton, who I hadn't heard of, I'll admit, before any of this. He was a great character, and another, I suppose, maybe lesser known, but very important, as the first GAA correspondent. Again, I'm thinking this would be something great for the museum to do at some point.
Yeah, and died again, tragically young. Brought home to Wexford, absolutely devastated a huge number of people who knew him. Died in I don't think he was much more than 40 when he died, if even 40. Brought home to Wexford, where he was from. But a man who devoted not just his working life, in which he was a GAA correspondent, but also his spare time to promoting Gaelic games, and in particular hurling. And he was a devoted member of the Metropolitans Hurling Club in the 1880s.
Yeah.
The 1890s. Like, he is one of that generation of people, and it's a bit of a shame of the way history, and it's inevitable in some respects because you can't give tribute to everybody. But it's a reminder that for an organisation like the GAA to thrive or to prosper or to survive, it requires dedication from a huge number of people. And anybody who doubts that, look at the club which is nearest to them at home, and look at the generations of people who are not known really outside the confines of that club. And even back several generations, they're not known even within that club, except they might be more particular. But without whom there would have been no pitch, without whom there would have been no county championship, and so on. And this is the I suppose the unknown volunteer or the unheralded volunteer who repeatedly does the work that allows other things to happen.
Yeah, I thought, I'd love to know more about him. I loved the way he described, his hurley, and, he was very modern in his approach to hurling even then, and didn't like people running onto the pitch, because there's some it is very funny, some of the things that happen. I loved one fan was angry and just pulled up the goalposts in one of the
goalposts. Unhappy with the way things were proceeding. Didn't suit him or his team. so it pulls up the goalposts. You have players, you have supporters running onto the field, and this just appalls Sutton, because Sutton saw himself as a modern part of the modern sporting revolution, which involves people staying behind the fence, about sport being organised, played according to rules and to a particular standard. And he despised that idea. Of course, part of the reason why crowds went to GAA matches was to see the madness of what went on. And it was, and the GAA still is and remains, and we all pay homage to this idea that fighting is terrible and people shouldn't be at each other. But a good row, or the promise of a good row, was never really known to lessen a crowd. And that's as true for the 1880s. And I would say that people go to local rivalries in the hope of seeing a bit of a spark sometimes.
Yeah, probably more locally than anything, I guess. Yeah. My last question, if anyone has anything before we wrap it up, you can just type it away there. I found the end of the book, I have it here just to remind me, quite emotional. There was one piece, now I won't be able to find it, I bet you. Yeah, it was the guy Stapleton, when he was so he was the last basically remaining player when he died in the 40s, the late 40s, and I just thought that the fact that the match was on his mind at that time in his life, he was obviously quite old then, and that was his concern. And you write that, well, he wrote, "All I'm concerned about now is to give honour where honour is due and clear all doubts. I had the honour of captaining them, and I'm the only survivor now of as fine a team of men as ever represented their county." I thought, and to name them, and what a gift, I suppose, for us that we do have some names thanks to him. But isn't it incredible that the match was on his mind, I suppose, of everything that had happened? That was a long time before.
And it's amazing. That's partly related, Julianne, to the controversy over that team, because that Thurles team that won the first All-Ireland was illegal. You were meant to play for the club that you were being from, but Thurles pulled in players from surrounding clubs to help them win that match in the end. And we love to say in the GAA about how we're given to parish and all that, but we're also given hugely to winning. And we've seen events last week and this week where people are more than happy to break rules if we would help them win a match or help them prepare properly. And people will kind of do what they want to do. There's a lawlessness to it in terms of winning. So there was huge controversy in Thurles on the morning of the game, where players went to the station in Thurles to get the train to Burr, which is an amazing thing that you would get the train to Burr from Thurles.
Yes, I know.
Went there and were left on the platform because they had looked for expenses and were left there, and players who'd been brought in from other clubs were there. And through the decades that followed, some of the players who were left on the platform wrote their account of what happened. So Stapleton is the last account, but it's not the only account. So you get successive layered accounts through the decades, and it shows you how things live on 60 years later, essentially. He's in his 80s, he was 60 years later still writing about something which is at that point a fundamental moment in Irish sporting history, the playing of the first All-Ireland hurling final. Yeah,
but as you say, those who live the longest get to tell the story.
It's not just those who win. It's not just those who win. If you live longer than anyone else, you have a good chance.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's one more question in. How important was GAA in the cultural revival?
Yeah, again, a brilliant question to which there is no easy answer, but there's a good 1 hour lecture in it if people stay around. No. How important was the GAA in it?
It's a good lead insert topic, actually.
Yeah, it's a great lead insert topic. It depends on who you are. So there were people for whom being involved in the GAA was fundamental to their sense of identity in cultural terms, who saw the GAA, being involved in the GAA, as an exposition of their Irishness, along with the language and along with the music, and was an entry point for them into that. They believed in the idea of using the GAA to create a sense of Irish identity, and ideally to create a sense of identity which would pull people towards an idea of independence, political independence for Britain. There were other people who were kind of in agreement with that, and then there were other people who didn't give two blind hoots but wanted to play the games.
Yeah.
The GAA is a broad church of those things, and the problem for the GAA has always been for those ideologues on the left or on the right, in the sense of those who really wished for Ireland the GAA to be used for this idea of promoting ideas of Irishness. They despaired at some of their other many, and if not most, of their other members of the association who just could not live up to their cultural ambitions because they were not interested in them. And they did not view somebody as lesser of an Irish person because they played rugby or because soccer, number one. And number two, they didn't see their identity in terms of their nationalist identity or national identity as being defined by the shape of the ball they kicked.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's probably still a thing that's ongoing, isn't it? Really, and you know, it's some of the stuff is so relevant. I was laughing at things like even that there was a post-match banquet after the first match. Like that's amazing. You know, we think that's our new thing, not at all. Yeah, I found it great. It was an amazing book, and I'm glad for the book club that I read it because I'm not great for non-fiction generally. So. But this was probably, you couldn't make it up. So in many ways,
I remember doing the research on it and just thinking, this stuff, it actually couldn't work as fiction. You couldn't get away with it as fiction because it's almost too wild.
Wild is a good word for a lot of it.
It's almost unbelievable. It is unbelievable some of the things that happen and the series of things that happen, one thing after the next, all building on each other.
Yeah, no, it was brilliant. Well, thank you. Congratulations on the book. I know it's out a while.
Thank you much, Jan. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us. I am just going to wrap up now. Yes, a few thank yous coming in as well. So thanks everyone for staying with me, and I'm glad that I was able to not be as annoying with the technology tonight as well. Our next book we're announcing it tomorrow, but as soon as you've all stayed for the hour, I can let you know now that it is the Christy O'Connor's book Last Man Standing, which is about hurling goalkeepers. So it looks like a really interesting and slightly different maybe than we've had.
Great book.
Yeah, so and Christy is going to do a talk with us early next month as well, and I have a couple more planned then. So I'm hoping to keep it going, even if the museum does reopen. I think the book club is a nice thing to keep going, and we have a nice little community. So any ideas or anything, please email me. I have the book club email address, or you can just send a general message to the museum either. I'm just publishing some of the thank yous there for you as well, Paul. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks for coming as well.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Okay.